Welcome back to the Gardening with Joy and Holly radio show. Happy you chose us to be part of your day. Holly, let's go to the hotline and bring in our guest for this week.
Nancy Lawson is a master naturalist, gardener, and author of a couple of books, including The Humane Gardener, Nurturing a Backyard Habitat for Wildlife, and also her recent book called Wildscape. She's also a columnist and for All Animals magazine. She's the founder of Humane Gardener as well. Welcome to the program, Nancy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, we want to thank you for taking time out of your day and not only to educate Holly and me, but all of our listeners.
So, Nancy, what is a humane gardener?
Well, it's someone who at least tries to see the world through the eyes of the animals living in their spaces, in their gardens, among the plants, and not just the species that everyone loves to love, right? Like the birds and the butterflies, but also beetles and rabbits and deer and frogs and bees and everyone else. Because that way, once you start to kind of try to understand how these animals are seeing the world, you can, and what their habits are and what their needs are, you can look at different ways to manage your outdoor landscapes and make them as hospitable as possible for wildlife, because a lot of them, of course, are having trouble now.
Right. So you kind of, here's what I want to do here. I'll give a little spot for the animals and we can coexist peacefully is kind of is that kind of the mindset?
Yeah, that's right. Welcoming them, and then also trying to prevent conflict or resolve conflicts humanely when they do come up, especially with mammals.
Go ahead.
So what are the tenets of humane gardening?
So there's a few kind of key principles that the book goes through and that I talk about a lot in my presentations. And one is to of course, plant native plants that wildlife have co-evolved with in your garden, even if you have a vegetable garden or no matter what kind of space you have, you can always add some native plants to it because those are the things that the animals have evolved with. But I also try to help people see what they might already have in their yards. So a lot of times we're mowing down or digging out plants that are actually from the region that we live in, but people don't realize that. They think they're weeds, and those can be some of the most helpful plants for wildlife. And so nurturing plants, sort of trying to figure out what you've got, and then cultivating with care, meaning, avoiding harm as much as possible to the animals that are already living in your space. So, I think we've probably all had the experience where you're digging and all of a sudden you come across a toad or something like that. It's very easy to kind of accidentally go in there quickly with our power tools and harm animals unintentionally. So kind of moving more mindfully and slowly through the landscape when we can. And then supporting life in the decay. So incorporating that dead wood and the fallen leaves, these things that, fireflies need to lay their eggs and bees need to overwinter in, and birds, nesting and tree snags and things like that. And so there's ways to do that in even in a manicured space, incorporate those elements kind of artfully. And then creating a no hazard zone by mitigating unintended dangers. So things like, things that people don't tend to realize, like garden netting is supposed to protect plants, but it actually can if it's not taut and pulled tight, it can ensnare snakes and birds and other animals. And tree trimming, that often will inadvertently disturb bird nesting sites and other nesting sites. So being careful about when you do that. And then, as I mentioned, figuring out some humane strategies for conflict resolution when that does occur.
Absolutely. Tell us more about your books that you have available, with a synopsis of both of them, and what would intrigue our listeners to pick up copies.
Yeah, so the first book is very much on what I just talked about, and I wrote it with the idea of helping people kind of bridge that divide between, there were people at the time in my world who I knew were already gardening for wildlife and trying to welcome wildlife, but maybe only certain types of wildlife. And then there were people who really didn't want any animals eating their plants, and were in constant conflict. And so this book was kind of written to try to build a bridge between the two and show people how they can have wildlife in their spaces and also coexist with them. The second book, Wildscape, is on the sensory experience of plants and animals in your landscape, and how sometimes we might be disrupting them through odor pollution, light pollution, noise pollution. And excuse me, so I spent a lot of time kind of just doing a lot of observation in my own habitat and looking at what the interactions were kind of on an intimate level between plants and animals, how they were vocalizing, how they might be using scent in the landscape to hide or to find food and that sort of thing. So that was, and I interviewed a lot of scientists and read a lot of studies to try to interpret what I was seeing. So that was the second book, and kind of a follow-up, I guess, to the first.
Well, I'll ask you this. What are some common challenges people may face trying to be humane gardening? And I bring that up as being you have a critter, that like a raccoon, that doesn't want to leave your area and causing problems, or you deal with infestation of maybe bees or wasps. What is the best way, or how would you recommend addressing those situations?
Yeah, I think sometimes we go all in right away and have an instant reaction to something, and sometimes that's understandable. When people have a fear or they feel encroached upon. But oftentimes, first of all, patience is really important, because a lot of these animals are just moving through the landscape. They're not actually, people think, I've seen this skunk, now it means I'm going to have 50 skunks in my yard or something like that. But actually, you might see them once or twice and never again. These animals tend to hide. Snakes are here all over the place in our gardens, but most of us don't see them very often. For example, that's just one example of an animal that doesn't really want to be seen. And so I think learning a little bit about the natural history, there's very easy, quick information you can find online. The place that I used to work, where I first started learning about these issues at the Humane Society of the U.S., has some wonderful information on wildneighbors.org is the URL. And that kind of gives some background on the animals' life histories, their habits, and also some tips for addressing some of those conflicts are often just even perceived conflicts. Sometimes it's not really an issue at all, and you need to just step back and sort of assess what it really might be before doing anything about it. So I think the biggest challenge is a mindset shift.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. Now, I just want to switch gears. You are a master naturalist. What is a master naturalist? I know you're also a master gardener. A lot of people are familiar with that, but what is the master naturalist, and what is your, I guess, role or duty in society?
Yeah. Well, so a lot of states have master naturalist programs, and it's usually in conjunction with a state agency like the Department of Natural Resources, and they'll do trainings. When your first year, you take 40 hours or whatever your state requires of classes, and in pretty much everything flora and fauna. So it's pretty much a fire hose of information, but mainly it just exposes you to the resources that are out there where you can learn more. And also the goal is to, just like with master gardeners, to train people who will be able to then go out and help educate the community about the flora and fauna who live among them. And so there's a lot of us volunteer at the nature centers and conservancies, and we advocate for like I joined our our Bee City campaign in our county, which focuses on advocating for native bees and helping people create more habitat for them. And so yeah, it's pretty much all things plant and animal.
So, in your backyard, in your area, your landscape, what is an animal or insect that you like to see that other people may be like, well, I really wouldn't want that in my area?
Well, it's funny you ask, because I haven't written about this yet, but I saw a couple of weeks ago. I thought it was so amazing. Have you ever seen a rainbow scarab beetle?
I have not.
I don't think so, no.
So lately we've had like more than usual numbers of piles of poop from raccoons and foxes and stuff in the pathways, and we're like, what is going on? But they get cleaned up quickly, and it turns out that this rainbow scarab beetle that we started seeing is actually a kind of dung beetle.
Huh.
And and so they pretty much spend their whole lives in the poop. They take it, underneath. They lay their eggs in there, and so that's one example. I just love seeing like new creatures like that. It's fascinating to me. I love, people probably don't like. A lot of people don't like deer because they eat plants, but I've actually got a lot of planting strategies for just sort of sharing with them. And they do eat some of my plants, but we're completely filled to the gills with vegetation here. And so, and we weren't in the past. We had mainly lawn when we moved to our house. So I think, those are things there are things probably that I was scared to see when we first moved to our place. But as I started to kind of watch them and think about it and look at them up close, I realized that it's everybody else's home too. And they're probably way more scared of me than I am of them. So
right. And the neat thing about it, and as you get older, you learn this, we don't need really do anything with nature. It'll take care of itself. We're just here to observe what's going on.
Right. Yeah, it's so true. It's like the more you have that attitude, I think the easier it becomes.
Yeah, you don't have to try to feel like you're in control. It'll do its own thing. You just sit back and watch.
Exactly.
Well, Nancy, we greatly appreciate the time you've offered Holly and myself. How can people find out more about you and obtain your books?
Yeah. So I have a website, humangardener.com, and I have a newsletter and a blog there that you can sign up for. Or I'm also on social media, at Facebook and Instagram primarily. Just the handle is Human Gardener. And the books you can get, in a lot of bookstores or on Amazon or the other online retailers.
Well, Nancy, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge that you've offered Holly and myself. We appreciate that very much.
Thank you for having me.